Well, it's my real pleasure to be in conversation this morning with Avgi Saketopoulou. Is that all right? Did I pronounce it correctly? Okay, good. There is, of course, a more extensive introduction to her work on the website, but I did just want to say that that Avgi is coming to us from mostly from outside the academy, although she's sometimes within the academy. She is a practicing analyst in New York City, and she works, as you may have gathered from the reading, around questions of trauma, queerness, gender diversity, among other areas. And she serves on the faculty of the NYU postdoctoral program. She is the author of Sexuality Beyond Consent, which we've been given the introduction of to read today. Sexuality Beyond Consent, the subtitle, importantly, is Risk, Race, Traumatophilia. With Anne Pellegrini, Gender Without Identity, also from 2023. So, I mean, I don't know what's going on there, but there's too much. Extraordinary productivity in 2023. And also, she has worked with Dominique Scarfon on the reality of the message, which is, as I understand it, a conversation about the work of Jean Laplanche, which I haven't actually read yet, but I look forward to doing that. We didn't plan our coordinated clothing, but there's a commonality in our interests, and that is on psychoanalysis, and so we will be shifting registers somewhat, and I say this, I say somewhat because I feel as if, to my mind, to my registers of interpretation, there have been discussions that have been informed by psychoanalysis, even if they have not been directly pertaining to psychoanalysis. The introduction that you received starts, of course, with a slap, and a sexual slap. And that is not the register that we've been having our conversations in. And so I want to actually just start us off with the acknowledgement of that. As a way of thinking about how psychoanalysis comes into the realm of the humanities today. I think that, to my mind, Avgi, one of the things that's very striking about the book is that it in many ways draws on conversations that we had before, right, and makes something quite specific of them in the moment of today. So there is definitely an ethic that is shaped by Bataille on the question of formlessness. There is a turn to Jean Laplanche, and particularly on the question of the sexual and on a kind of polymorphous perversity, a dwelling on the question of the perverse as a way of risking something, risking everything, in fact, one might say. And also there is definitely a way in which the sexual is foregrounded in the psychoanalytic work in a way that hasn't always been the case. One could say that there was a wave of psychoanalytic thinking with the humanities, obviously with Freud and his contemporaries themselves in their interest in the literary. There was a wave of character analysis that was very psychoanalytically informed, certainly in a moment of high deconstruction. The work on literature and psychoanalysis was really looking at the forms of signification and the ways in the manner in which the signifier drops beneath the bar of signification as something that we need to understand in terms of the aesthetic and the literary, and certainly with the with the Slovenian groups, for example, an attention to ideology. Certainly also within feminist psychoanalysis, a question of sexual difference sometimes took us away from sex itself, as a way of thinking about sexual difference as the yet to be thought that is available as one way of reading psychoanalysis. And queer theory did take us to sex. It definitely took us to sex. And there's a question about whether queer theory is still doing that, right? Whether sex is in play in the same way in queer theory as it once was. So I wanted to just sort of sketch that out a little bit to sort of think about where psychoanalysis enters into conversations in the fields of the humanities more broadly. I will also say that we have been talking about risk in relation to danger somewhat over the last few days. So risk, on the one hand, is something that is understood as being the engine of a security state, you know, when in fact what we have is danger. And there are different kinds of ways in which we have to understand how sovereignty is taken away from us by the security state when we are also unable to understand what danger is. We've also been talking about walls. Yesterday, Judith Butler's talk was addressing questions of academic freedom in relation to the intramural and walls. And it strikes me very much that you are interested in walls of a certain sort. I'm not sure if they are walls of the skin. They're certainly walls of the ego at various points. And one way I think of maybe starting us off from this register, these different registers, so we can get to sex, is the ways in which you bring up the question of the abject. Again, an older conversation in a way from Kristeva, as that which threatens the walls. It threatens the relation of subject and object. And it causes us to expel things from outside the walls. So I was wondering if you could maybe start us off there.
Sure. Thank you. Good morning. I want to start with thanking you for being in conversation with me today. This is very exciting, and thanking Steve and Bess for inviting me, and thanking you all for spending some of your life with us this morning. I think I want to start with a couple of different things that you picked up on in terms of kind of like Bataille and Laplanche, because indeed there is a return in part of what I'm doing to the things before. But in kind of like in the psychoanalytic idiom, every return, it's kind of like in the Laplanchian idiom especially, is not a circling back, but a kind of spiral movement that from a certain two-dimensional perspective can look like we're just going back to the same things. But we're going back with a different kind of temporality. And I think that that's what kind of like grounds and also inflects my project. And what Bataille and Laplanche share, which a lot of other psychoanalytic schools do not have the privilege and also the trouble of having to deal with, is kind of like questions of expenditure, questions of kind of like the excess of the more and more of the drive, and the kind of strange sovereignty that comes with a sexual. And that's not the sovereignty of kind of like the subject who wills themselves over another or wills themselves over their conditions, but a kind of sovereignty that I am trying to speak to as a resistance to being willed by others, or being conducted on the basis of identity categories, or being conducted on the basis of how a subject is supposed to act, especially minoritarian subjects, kind of like racialized subjects, and sexually and gender minoritized subjects are especially subject to these kinds of pressures. So my kind of like interest in the object also comes from there, and comes from the ways in which kind of like trauma I don't so much come from a Christavian perspective where kind of like she thinks with the object in terms of like the early parental-maternal relationship, partly because I don't like to think with biological relations or even with a heteronormative kind of like structure or the maternal kind of like constraints that kind of model puts upon it. But thinking with the ways in which trauma makes us object to ourselves and object to others, and the propensity, if not fixation, that many fields have, including and especially my field, on repairing trauma, on curing trauma, on kind of like restoring the subject in some imaginary prelapsarian moment. And that's the way in which I think objection opens up a lot of space to think with the sexual.
Thank you. Thanks. I mean, I think that, one of the things that is so intriguing about this book is how much it actually speaks to a resistance to the reparative, right? And so, and what I mean by that is the way in which you look to to an understanding of trauma that is not about something that needs to be worked through, something that we need to become resilient in relation to, but something that we need to keep touching. And that's troubling. It's a troubling concept. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about the resistance to the reparative.
I really appreciate this prompt because this is a big part of the project in this book and in what I'm working next on exigent sadism. I'm gonna kind of like give a short line about this. I can't say enough bad things about the reparative. The reparative has been, I think there's two kind of like two lines of thinking that I want to introduce in this respect. The one, which is kind of like very prominent in the book, is the idea that kind of like there is this fantasy, this fiction, that psychoanalysis especially, but also kind of like queer theory, especially through the way in which Sedgwick uses Klein, and then kind of like the reparative turn in affect studies, kind of like takes over, where the idea is that kind of like there's something that can be repaired, which imagines kind of like critical to that kind of framework is an imagining that there was a before to trauma. There was a before to a traumatized subject, to which, A, that there was a before, and B, that it is possible to restore ourselves there. But there are several psychoanalytic theories, of which Laplanche, who is the most influential for me, is certainly one, that starts with the premise that there is no intactness to our being, to which we may be restored. And in fact, kind of like one of the pressures that I put on the notion of kind of like the notion of working through trauma is to argue that this approach to trauma is actually traumatophobic. And by traumatophobia, I'm referring to the idea of trying to make trauma disappear, trying to make it go away, to cure it, to heal it, to work it through, to sublimate it into kind of like utile projects. And I think that, A, that's an impossibility. I mean, any analyst you sit with will tell you that's an impossibility. And yet, even kind of like those of us who work clinically, when we sit in the consulting room, kind of like when we consult with colleagues, when we speak in conferences, you'll hear analysts say all the time, I thought that we had worked through such and such, and yet at that moment it popped up. So kind of like these are the moments that kind of like you realize that this notion, this Lowoldian notion of turning ghosts into ancestors that continue to inform us from the past, but they're not actively speaking in real time. They're not chattering, there's no echoes, there's no hauntings, to use one of the terms from your book. Kind of like that actually is an impossibility. The other thing, the idea that there is something that breaks us, kind of like I think is, and that there are subjects that are intact and may benefit from kind of like this fantasy of intactness. I think there's kind of like the operations of whiteness and white logics are very tied together with traumatophobic logics. Because what is the subject that we imagine as being both unbroken and deserving to be unbreakable? I think that this is how whiteness insinuates itself into our trauma theories, and why kind of like we need to break with the reparative. Like, I know that this is a very troubling and challenging idea.
Thank you for that. I actually want to ask you about this term whiteness that you use. I'd love you to just expand on what you mean by whiteness. What does it stand in for, or is it descriptive? Does it stand in for something? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it certainly doesn't stand for skin pigment or history. It stands for a certain set of hegemonic logics that affiliate themselves with, or want to be, or aspire to being affiliated with dominant structures. And psychoanalysis has certainly been a big propagator of whiteness and of, like, even kind of like, as I was saying earlier, the notion of working through or curing something and restoring a subject to a place where they're uninterrupted, when in fact, being uninterrupted is not something that's available to anyone. In fact, like, the way in which white subjects support that is by projecting and finding that brokenness in racialized subjects or cis subjects and trans subjects, kind of like where it is encountered as a damage that needs to be restored in the other. Hence, the enthusiastic and problematically enthusiastic response that psychoanalysis right now has in post-colonial studies, which I think actually ground its whiteness by engaging with the trauma of otherness while securing itself in kind of like a kind of intactness and unbrokenness, merely by virtue of engaging in that kind of project.
So otherness, intactness, opacity. Opacity is a key term in the introduction and in the book, of course. So could you tell us about opacity?
Yeah. There are many ways in which kind of like psychoanalysis theorizes the unconscious, and kind of like there are certainly ways of thinking about unconscious life as being kind of like a storehouse of repressed materials, things you can't bear to think about, prejudices like the notion of unconscious racism, painful, traumatic events that you cannot bear to think, incompatible ideas, and so on and so forth. But then there's also different ways of conceptualizing the unconscious, of which Laplanche's is one, that understands the unconscious as being kind of like the way that I describe it in the book is an enduring opacity, meaning that it is ontologically opaque and can never be recovered into something. You always have to kind of like struggle with the incommensurability of the unconscious with everything else. And I actually owe to Amber Musser, kind of like, who was one of my readers, thankfully, in the book, the intervention to think with Glissant, which has proven to me to be extremely generative. But this is kind of like very antithetical to our inclination as human beings to want to make meanings of things and to want to organize things. So it's not, this is the idea that there's an ontologically opaque unconscious is not something that we can ever understand or come to terms with. It has to be wrested from the self each time. It's a continuous project.
And this is where the question of risk also comes in, of course. So it's sort of risking a relation to the opacity, or maybe risking a non-relation to opacity is a better way of putting it.
Which is also about the sexual.
Yes. So why don't you take us there?
Well, what I would say is that kind of like part of what makes the unconscious ontologically opaque is the fact that it is kind of like its energy is dispersive. It's centripetal, not centrifugal. It works kind of like towards unbinding and towards resisting psychic organization, which is what makes it so frightening and impossible to kind of like master as a concept, but it's also what makes it so generative. And this is kind of like where the notion of the reparative, which seeks to tame these energies and organize the sexual and the sexual energies of trauma, because one of the things that I'm really interested in is in thinking about sexuality and trauma together, the erotic and trauma together, that the energies of trauma can actually prove transformative. Like, they're not just frightening, they don't just stall us or stop us in our tracks. They can also be extremely politically agnostic. That's the tricky part. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about politics. Politically agnostic, but nevertheless potentially transformative.
Right. So, I mean, I remember when I first started running the Humanities Institute at Duke, I don't think I introduced myself. I'm Ranjana Khanna, Director of the Humanities Institute at Duke. I'm sorry about that. But when I first started running the Humanities Institute at Duke, was very much in a Me Too moment, and I wanted to do some readings on that. I'd also run a gender, sexuality and feminist studies department for 7 years, and so this was very much on my mind. It felt to me that we needed to have a discussion about Me Too and where the work on desire, which is not a term that you use a huge amount, actually. I'll ask you about that later. Where the work of desire, complexity, masochism come into play around Me Too. How is it that Me Too is understanding what sex is and what sexuality is, and how one understands an absolute breach of conduct and a form of violence that is easily understood as egregious, or maybe not easily. I don't mean easily, but alongside something that is more ambiguous. It felt as if that body of work around desire that had been done, and the complexity of desire, pleasure and danger from another moment, was not, didn't have, there was no room for it. To be sure, there were some articles, Jacqueline Rose in the London Review of Books, for example, and others who were pushing against something, but it was a delicate moment. And so I thought maybe you could say something about that, about, you know, to some extent there's this tendency to, well, I had this tendency to think, you know, maybe there needs to be a correction and then we address this, you know, a correction in terms of how Me Too was going to unfold, and then we address this. But maybe that's not the right way to go. I mean, you know, there's obviously right ways and wrong ways with these sorts of things, about in terms of when you have a difficult discussion, what the political consequences of it are, and how you begin to address it in a moment in which some important work is being done politically, even as it is highly problematic in its conceptualization. So I was wondering if you'd actually thought about that in terms of political movements of feminism, where violation around the idea of consent is something that is being addressed.
Yeah. This is, I think, a really key question, and it takes me back to what we were saying earlier about returning to the before, because I think that you're absolutely right in saying that, at least to me, you're absolutely right in saying kind of like that some work needed to be done before kind of like the kinds of things that I put forward in the book are thinkable without them being collapsed into violation. So kind of like I talk a lot in the book about this concept of limit consent, arguing that while the no of consent can be violated, there is no such thing as yes, in the sense that kind of like you sign up for one thing, but you don't quite know what you'll get until after the fact. And then oftentimes kind of like you have to figure out what your relationship will be in the gap between what you thought you were signing up for and bargained for, and you nevertheless didn't ask for it but got. And that gap seems to me to be a very generative place. There's been a lot of work, certainly in kind of like feminisms, and especially kind of like, the book is very influenced by women of color feminisms, especially Black feminisms, in thinking about consent in the context of kind of like the antebellum South and kind of like the legacy of enslavement of peoples. And without that work, I wouldn't be able to put the pressure on consent that I put on. But part of why this has felt to be an important project to me is because this notion of the kind of safety or security that is promised us by consent actually, I think, impoverishes us. This is not to say that, this is not to dictate to anybody how they should conduct their own personal relations, but it is to alert us to the fact that consent is a conservative concept. It is conservative in the sense that, in so many ways, so many people have written about this, but in the sense that it treats the gap between what you didn't bargain for and what you got as harm, when in fact it can open up to all kinds of possibilities, harm being one of them. Like, we cannot exclude that from the beginning. So in the first chapter, I talk about two patients. One of them is Carmen, who is slapped by her lover in a way that feels so exquisite. I mean, her lover has done nothing that she has not signed up for. And my patient knows that. And nevertheless, she safe words, not because she violated her limits, but because it was too good, right? And then I talk about a patient who I call Mia, who has a really good first session with me, and then feels that I totally screwed her by arousing a desire in her to come and see me, which she now has to pay to come and pay, which she calls is an uncomfortable amount, even though she can afford it. So the first patient encounters this gap between what she didn't agree to and got with shutting it down. Mia does something much more perverse in some way, and I use the word perverse in the polymorphous way that Freud uses it. She says, okay, we're in a bind, you screwed me, I still want to see you, we'll work together, but it's going to be against my consent. Which is a very paradoxical condition to start a treatment for her and for me. So that can be a generative condition for putting something in motion. And no question, that's going to be very messy. But stepping into the fray, especially stepping into the fray with another person, I think can open up all kinds of possibilities that we shut down when we become too preoccupied with boundaries.
So could you maybe say a little bit more about seduction, which is where you get to at the end of the introduction, and then take it up in the next couple of chapters?
Yeah. I mean, seduction is used in this book not in the sense of manipulation or tricking somebody into something, but in from a metapsychological perspective through Jean Laplanche, who speaks about how in the original asymmetrical relation between an adult and a child, but also to some degree in all relationships, between adults, there is an excess of a sexual unconscious on one side, and that means that something travels, so to speak, like a stowaway passenger, Dominique Scarfone says, on conscious messages of communication that pierces the other enigmatically. And that enigmatic piercing is not enigmatic in the sense of, well, the infant is an infant, they don't have a developed emotional or intellectual apparatus, of course they're going to not understand what's happening. It's ontologically enigmatic, it is opaque in the way that we were describing earlier. And that lands on the infant's psychophysiological skin and is impossible to fully make sense of. And for Laplanche, that's what becomes the sexual unconscious of the child. So the sexual unconscious of the child gets instituted through this process of that which the child cannot manage, cannot churn into meaning. And what this, and Laplanche calls this seduction, to speak about how the infant is seduced in some way into this process of becoming human. And for him, humanity is about the structuralization of the psyche, where you some things become translated into meaning, and the rest gets repressed and institutes a category that we're actually not born with. And he is, I think, unique among analysts in believing that you're not born with an unconscious, but it arises in the inevitable encounter with an adult.
Thank you. Thanks. So, so maybe back to this slap and the title of the introduction, The Erotics of the Terribly Beautiful. I'd love you to say more about the terribly beautiful and the experience of the aesthetic that you describe here, where you say that psychoanalysis effectively becomes an aesthetic experience. I want to understand this terribly beautiful a little bit more. You know, I was thinking that, you know, when and also in relation to ethics, actually, certainly in Lacan's ethics, there is the sense, there is the description of Antigone as the figure who is stunning and throws everything off, right? There is a breach of everything, right? Of the law of the family, the law of the state. Everything is thrown off by her apparently irrational demand to bury her brother, in relation to the singularity of that brother. I was also thinking of an early essay by Leo Bassani from 1974, where he's writing on Madame Bovary, and he talks about the kind of luminosity that surrounds Madame Bovary. It's an essay where he's talking about how desire gets written as love, and in Madame Bovary, through that luminosity of her, of the way in which she's presented in this luminous way when she's sort of reaching her tongue down to the bottom of the glass, for example. He has a series of examples. It's always with this sort of sense of light around her. And it is this idea of the terribly beautiful that almost reminds us of desire that pushes against the narrative of love, as it were. And so I wanted more on the terribly beautiful here. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
I think, you know, terribly beautiful is a phrase that I take from Fred Moten's work in his discussion of Emmett Till. And I use terrible quite seriously here, kind of like, you know, when you were asking me, the thing that came to my mind was kind of like these images that we see coming out of Gaza and Rafah these days, of kind of like charred bodies. And what does it mean to look at these charred bodies, decapitated bodies, bodies that are kind of like harmed in ways that feel unbearable to watch? And Fred Moten's intervention, kind of like when you were talking about like breaking the rules, like is very much about like, you know, Emmett Till's mother decides to display the body. And we have now kind of like Palestinian parents displaying the bodies of their children for the world to see. And I was talking to a colleague of mine when Aaron Bushnell burned himself, self-immolated, and I said, "Did you watch it?" And she said, "No, I can't bear to watch it." And I said to her, he burned himself so that we would watch it. And that's the question of ethics, right? One of the things that Moten says about Emmett Till is he wants to pull us away from the like oculocentral aspect of like engaging with the terrible, and he asks us to listen to the photograph of Emmett Till, to kind of like tune into another register. And I become very curious in like, what does it mean to tune into that register? What's the register? There's no music in the photograph. What are you listening for? And this move away from what you are looking at into what you're listening for, I think in some way, at least the way that I interpret it in the book, it galvanizes your own fantasy, including quite perversely erotic fantasy. And by erotic fantasy, I don't mean sexual fantasy, even though that too might come up, but the kinds of excitations and excitements and bodily stimulations that come up in the encounter with the terrible. And that there's something deeply, I think, ethical, if not an ethics of responsibility, an ethics of responsiveness that happen in those spaces, in encountering things that actually are at the borders of what we can bear. This will take us to risk, that actually force us to engage with a world that is not the world that we want to believe exists, but which is nevertheless the world that many subjects are slaughtered for, and which, like, if you're, like, depending on your subject position, there's always ways in which you can pull back from that. And what does it mean to risk the self? I think there is a risking of the self in watching kind of like Bushnell self-immolate and actually allow that to act upon you, as opposed to being exposed to that with an eye towards understanding what he's doing and what is this about, which is more a project of mastery, to allow the image of Emmett Till to act upon you. And these are all images, like if you think about kind of like especially Emmett Till, they come from a history of sexualized fantasy, right? So Emmett Till gets kind of like brutally murdered because of a white woman's fantasy, sexual fantasy about his predation of her, right? So kind of like this is built into these images, and it's built into kind of like the intensity of a body that is in some version, that is on the boundaries of vulnerability and brutality in ways that we don't want to see.
Thank you. Thanks. I was just thinking, I want to ask you about the specificity of how race is functioning in that moment, and then also in the book more broadly. Let me, and I'm coming to that partly because, you know, I've been doing some work on corpses. Recently, I was interested in Sarah Kaufman has a very beautiful essay about the Rembrandt painting, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, and in that she does a reading of the way in which this guild of student doctors are watching the Dr. Tulp give the anatomy lesson and open up the body of a thief, because, you know, the body would be of a thief, and there is a book, presumably the anatomy book, that is positioned on a lectern. His feet almost become a lectern, and the doctors are all looking to the book. Right? They sort of look to. Some of them look. There's this sort of oscillation in their gaze. It's almost as if the book, they're understanding that they're analyzing a corpse in order to understand life, actually, and so they're looking to the book, a corpus, which is about a life. So it's this reluctance to look at the corpse, in fact, and certainly, you know, in the controversy around the image of Ayaan Kurdi's body that was washed up on the beach, so I think raises some very interesting questions too around the specificity of a child's corpse.
Yes.
How do we look at that? Should the question of should also, should we look at that corpse is a fascinating and troubling one. So I'd love you to say something more about the specificity of the way in which you're addressing race and how risk comes into play around race in the book.
You know, I'm thinking of the kinds of images that you were describing about, kind of like images of a refugee child, a migrant child, washed up body, or kind of like even when you said kind of like the dead body on the kind of like before the lectern is a thief. Of course, it's a thief, because I think that there's so much there. Like, what are you looking away from when you're looking to knowledge, when you're looking to the anatomy map? You're also looking away from the social conditions that make some bodies available for experimentation and for dissecting and for being put on this kind of use for whose benefit? And kind of like the representational framework that is offered by knowledge, by medicine, by anatomy, by the atlas of kind of like information, work to actually settle these energies so that you could be in the presence of a body that has been sacrificed. I will go back to whiteness, and here by whiteness I don't mean to white people only, without being attentive to the sacrifice. And this is one of the problems with the reparative. The reparative requires the sacrifice as part of how it functions, and it invisibilizes the requirement of sacrifice by organizing us towards demanding actually our complicity to repairing the aggressor. And here, of course, I'm also borrowing from David Eng's critique of Melanie Klein. So kind of like once we start talking about like who gets repaired and whose damage or harm becomes unattended to, we are very much in the domain of how representational forms of thinking, as opposed to the aesthetic, as opposed to the erotics of the terribly beautiful, actually take us away from even thinking about social conditions and about race specifically. Like the ways in which bodies are both black and blackened through experience and through social conditions. And kind of like all of that is done in the interest of knowledge, explicitly in the interest of knowledge. I think obviously there are power relations beyond that. And in the injunction to not look, because this is some form of kind of like eroticizing or kind of like some kind of like trauma porn, is the way in which we are disciplined into actually not taking that seriously, I think. Because of course that kind of looking also has an erotic component. How could it not? And again, by erotic I don't mean sexual, but the overstimulation, the excess, the anxiety, all of these kind of like bubble up. And it's always easier to be to work towards settling these energies rather than risking what they could unsettle in us socially and culturally and individually, like risking the self.
Yes. Maybe you could tell us about a little bit about the some of the texts that you spend some time on here, the slave play. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the play first, and then go into how you analyze that, and why that play.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clearly the kernel.
Yeah,
of the
it's
book,
clearly the kernel.
Yes.
I mean, why that play? I'll give you the answer right now. I don't know still. I've been thinking around it. So Slave Play is a theatrical play by. Was written by a very gifted Black queer writer, Jeremy O'Harris, who I was taken to see the play by actually my partner, who apparently knows me very well, and she guarded what the play is about. I like to not know what I'm watching until. In the spirit of consent, the kind of consent I'm interested in. So I watched the play, and when the play finished, I was like really stunned by it, and I had this compelling experience to want to go and watch it again. And I watched the play many, many, many times, and I actually, up until now, maybe at some point I'll be over it, I'm not yet. I also follow the play when I can to different productions and notice differences. I've written about it a lot. The play is about kind of like a really strange, I would say, I mean, there's many ways to describe it. One could describe the plot. I don't know if you want me to do that as well.
Well, I think that you could, so we know where we're going with
yes.
this, a little briefly, yes.
So the general idea of the plot is that there's 3 acts. In the first act, you see 3 interracial couples engage in scenes that seem like to be scenes of kind of like racially tinged, racially humiliated sexual scenes, sexual encounters that are drawing on stereotypes coming from kind of like plantation life, and kind of like use racist iconography to kind of like bring that to the fore. And you have kind of like the first act ends with a moment that kind of like somebody, a white person actually, stops the action of the sexual encounter, but also the action of the first act, kind of like calling out a safe word, which is actually Starbucks, which is kind of like a lot can be said about that. It's a really interesting commentary. And then in the second act, you find out that actually these are not just as twisted as they seemed, or at least you're told that they're not as twisted as they seem, because what happens in the second act, you're told, kind of like you come to realize that all of these couples were participating in some odd kind of therapy that I should say is actually not a real therapy, which is called antebellum sexual performance therapy, where kind of like Black partners have actually scripted sexual scenarios that they want their white partners to enact with them, white or white passing partners. There are scenarios of racial sexual objection. So the scenarios have been requested by the Black partners. And the second act is a real exercise in kind of like organizing psychic energies. Like the first act is very upsetting. People get up and leave. Some people laugh. Some people gasp. There's a lot of audience reactions. Like Jeremy O. Harris was very attacked precisely for what happens in the first act. In the second act, like you get a lot of like lessons on kind of like DEI, like, you know, how white people act badly against black people, like all the kinds of things that kind of like go wrong in the first act, but it's also kind of predictable, like you can kind of see where it's going, but it is kind of like long and kind of like everyone has some aspect that they didn't quite catch in the first act. So you kind of like you're being taught something. Mm-hmm. And then the third act kind of like is actually really striking because instead of the three couples, so the three couples kind of like there's an explosion between all of them, and one of them returns kind of like to their private life in the bedroom, so to speak, to actually play this out again. Only the white man who safe worded kind of like actually enacts the scene that was asked of him. With results that are actually left quite ambivalent towards the end. So he is a British man, and I think that that's a very interesting choice. The only white man in the play is a British man who refuses initially to racially humiliate his partner sexually, who gets very upset, accusing him of not not acceding to her desire, not kind of like playing with her that way. But and in the third act, he actually does it. But you can't quite tell if he did it for her or if his own racism now comes out. Kind of like it's very kind of like deep-throated and very kind of like embodied in a way that it's completely messed up. And kind of like you end up in this messed up scene where she's extremely upset and you can't quite tell if this is what she wanted, if she got something that she thought she wanted but she didn't want, or if the fact of the upset and the way in which he actually ends up getting upset with himself is part of the point. And you're left in this side of enigmatic, something that is kind of like really disturbing. And the play has generated very varied and controversial responses. And I was really astonished by it precisely because it kind of like heats up to the point of kind of like the intolerable, this conjunction between trauma, consent, racialization, and interracial relations, and the erotic, which I thought was kind of like very daring. And also, like it really leaves you to hold. It really leaves you holding something, which I think really good art does.
Thanks. So I'm interested to use the term intolerable. It's one that Kaufman also uses, actually. But the intolerable seems to be an opening to risking experience, as you write in the book, and you talk about the category of the overwhelm in the nominal form, and which is an unusual use of the. We talk about being overwhelmed, but the overwhelm. Why the nominal form?
Well, because we talk about being overwhelmed as if it's a bad thing, and as if all it can do is damage us or harm us. And I'm very interested in what happens in these states of overwhelm that actually, like, escalate excitation. I don't mean excitement, but escalate intensity to the point where you yourself cannot remain intact, where something has to break in you. And kind of like that's the domain of risk, where the ego can come undone. And then you are kind of like very momentarily, the ego will very quickly reconstitute itself into something. But I think one way to understand these kind of like the great range of responses that you get to artistic work like slave play is kind of like what you see really is what happens in the new binding after somebody has reconstituted themselves. For some people it is, how could you do this to me? People have actually said, this was about race play. Like, I had no idea what I was getting into. And Jeremy O. Harris has very playfully said, the play is literally called slave play. Like, I don't know how else to tell you. And Robert O'Hara, the kind of like very brilliant director, has said, you've come to watch a play called Slave Play, like it's gonna cost you something. You can't just walk out of here like intact with what you've watched on the scene. Of course, unfold on the stage. Of course, you can always like re-intactivize yourself by turning what you saw, by pathologizing it, by saying this is some way of kind of like going against kind of like what the proper memory in relation to the history of slavery would be. But the question for me in the book, and that's the question of consent, is about the curiosity of what can arise when you give yourself over to an experience that you didn't expect, and see what might come up, and see, kind of like listen instead of watch for, and this is the Moten intervention, listen for what comes up in you as a mode of relating to the text of the play, to the embodied experience of the play. And that's a real risk to take.
I mean, you talk about this also in relation to The Night Porter.
Yes.
Which, of course, was also a very controversial film. People, I mean, when it came out, we didn't have the term genocidal rape. But certainly some of the arguments about it were about the how you think about sex and desire in relation in the context of genocide. So you've really, you pick you've gone to the
jugular.
You've gone to the jugular. You've gone to the points that we can't make sense of, and yet see a way in which people are making sense of the world that they live in nonetheless, or making sensation anyway of the world that they live in nonetheless. And you talk about, when you're writing about exigent sadism.
Can I say something before you jump to exigent sadism?
Sure.
Because I think this is where the word traumatophilia needs to come up, because all of these kind of like both The Night Porter and Slave Play, and even kind of like the image of Emmett Till, or the kinds of images we were describing earlier, kind of like are very traumatophilic ways of relating to experience, to actually be exposed to that rather than try to heal it or move away from it. And Liliana Cavani, who's the director of The Night Porter, which is a very disturbing movie, both The Night Porter and Slave Play, I think you can watch them a million times, you still don't know what happened. I mean, you can make it up, but constantly you'll hear Jeremy O. Harris in interviews saying, well, you say that, but it's not actually in the play. Well, at this point, such and such characters does so-and-so, and he'll say, she doesn't. Like, I wrote the play, I'm telling you, she doesn't. So there's something about this kind of like unanswerability of like, you can't relate to it on the level of why. Liliana Cavani, in talking about doing The Night Porter, talks about having gone and interviewed women who were in the camps, and specifically about the experience that one woman in the camps had, who says, like, who talks about, to Cavani talks, and De Laurentiis actually writes about this. She talks about kind of like how the world is trying to move on. This is the reparative, by the way, like to heal from trauma, to move forward. How do we keep going, right? The world is trying to move on, but she wants to stay with the fact that this happened, and that this kind of like to stay in the presence of the intensity of this happened. And kind of like, this is what I meant earlier when I was talking about how psychoanalysis right now is so enthralled with like addressing racism so that it can go away. But of course, racism is not going to go away because we're thinking about it. And this will take us to exigent sadism and the political implications of exigent sadism, which is that we have to start thinking about acting, kind of like not just thinking, but also how to have a theory of action when it comes to kind of like material conditions, and when it comes to how we're caught into inaction, I think in part by the reparative.
Thanks. And could you say something about sovereignty in relation to this? And we'll go to questions in a second now. Because I think that, there's a way in which, there's over the last, 15 years, I suppose, there's been such a lot of work on sovereignty in different in different forms, an earlier wave too of the question of decisionism in terms of in relation to sovereignty and the emergence into the political. You're talking about a sovereignty that's somewhat different,
very different
from decisionism or even from, say, the beast and the sovereign. So go ahead.
I think kind of like with a deep awareness of how the word sovereignty has been critiqued and kind of like taking very seriously all of these critiques, I think that there's something that we're missing when we're not thinking about the sovereignty of kind of like what I think of as the sovereignty of the sexual in us, which is indestructible by all civilizational efforts and which actually propels us not to anything in particular. It still has to join with something else, but the possibility for action comes from that kind of sovereignty. And, you know, I was kind of like, I've been developing the concept of exigent sadism to think about politics. And I was giving a paper on this a few weeks ago, and I was talking about, so I'm Greek, but I'm also Cypriot, and I grew up, because Cyprus is a post-colonial, up until 1960, it was under British rule, and it's now an occupied country. So I grew up in conditions of occupation. So a colleague of mine who knows this said to me, how can you talk about dispossession this way and sovereignty this way when you actually grew up in these conditions? And to me, it feels that it's precisely because I grew up in these conditions that it becomes urgent for me to actually talk about a sovereignty that is not about the willed decisional action on the environment that comes from a concentrated self, but which allows kind of like some imbrication of the sexual drive to come in, so that acting is more of an acceptance rather than a decision, that you have to act or else this is not livable. And that kind of action is a very different kind of action than the action that comes from a sovereign center. This is this kind of sovereignty that comes from the dispossessed agency, if we can call it that, of the unconscious, of the sexual drive. And therefore it has different kinds of energies, because these energies are continuously replenishable. These are renewable psychic energies, as opposed to the energy that comes from the domain of mastery, which we're always afraid we're going to run out of. But to have access to this renewable energy, you have to be risking the self. You can't try to preserve yourself and also make change. Like, you have to, it's going to cost you something, is a phrase that comes up a lot in the book. And exigent sadism costs us something. But without cost, there is no change. And this is what we see right now happening in so many of our institutions. Like, students and faculty are risking, especially students, are risking all kinds of things. For what end? I mean, there's hopes, there's aspirations, but whether these will happen or not is not just unknowable. I'm not even sure that students always believe them. And yet they throw themselves into it. And they squander their energies, not because they are not thoughtful or don't care about themselves or because their lives don't matter to them, but because sacrifice and cost is part of how action happens. So kind of like that takes us back to bataille and expenditure.
Right. Thank you. I'd like to open up for questions. There are 2 mics here. It'd be wonderful if you could come up and ask your questions there.
While we're waiting for that, I want to thank you for these really interesting questions.
Thank you.
A lot of fun to talk to you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Thanks so much. I'm Amanda Anderson from Brown University. So right at the very end, first of all, I want to thank you for an extraordinary conversation and for wonderful writing, which I deeply enjoyed reading. Toward the end, you talked about students and faculty, but my question, I have a question about the political, and I have a question about whether your approach is fundamentally individualistic, centered kind of on an intra-subjective experience and journey. And part of the reason I want to ask about this is I'm trying to figure out exactly who you're arguing against. The therapeutic culture is quite variable at this point with respect to trauma. And in fact, trauma, it seems like, is becoming quite universalized. I mean, just in the Times yesterday, there was, the increase in PTSD among students with no real demographic breakdown discussions. And so it seems as though there is a kind of, so there's a generalizable sense of trauma that's emerged, which I think works a little bit against some of the diagnostic distinctions that you're making with respect to race. But the other thing that I think is really important, and I'm really curious about, is so Judith Herman's work on trauma, Trauma and Recovery, 1992, which is about trauma in war veterans and then also domestic abuse trauma. Her argument is that, first of all, those forms of trauma would never have come to light if there had not been political movements, the women's movement and the anti-war movement. And they depathologized in a way, particularly in the case of war trauma. What had been in earlier, like in World War I, were called moral invalids, now gets cast as PTSD, and now you even have a term like moral injury, being brought to bear on trauma in war. And then in the case of domestic abuse, the feminist movement, right? And so one of the things that, so I'm really, I feel like there's a lot of differentiation among different approaches to how you treat trauma, and that there's a lot of work in the trauma field that I don't think it has an ideal of absolute cure, though there is a lot of that too, believe me, And so one of the things that you get in Herman is this notion of like higher levels of integration. And I'm curious to know what you think about that, whether that falls into the reparative, but a kind of integration that is linked to political awareness. So not just a kind of an awareness of, the unsettled, like the fact that we're not intact, but an awareness of the political field, a diagnosis of the political field, and connection with communities of others who have been harmed, so that it goes sort of beyond the individual. I mean, she's really into that aspect I'll say working through trauma, though she says, you never get over it. So like, there's not a sense of absolute cure. But what I'm struck by, I guess, part of my question is, the political in your account takes the shape of an analysis of the ground of distinctions that drive how different subjects respond to intactness, at-homeness, injury, okay? Whereas I think in her account, that takes place in the process of working through the trauma. It's about kind of figuring out the larger social field is part of the response to trauma. Like a political analysis is part of the response. It isn't just a part of the diagnosis of why we aren't cool enough about reparation and intactness, to put it a little bluntly. Anyway, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts on that.
Thank you. These are great questions. Let me start with the first one, which is that I think that, the question about kind of like community versus like intrapsychic. I don't think you can have one or the other. But I think unless communities get caught up in the fervor, you can think Reich, you can think Durkheim, you can think Freud with mass psychology. Unless communities get caught in the fervor, even in the good fervor, like, anti-racist fervor, unless communities get caught in that fervor, which I think is dangerous because it's short-lived and it's not for long-term change. It lives on the excitement of the moment. You also kind of like need at some point to also have subjects be able to kind of like check in with themselves. Like there is community, but there's also a sense of like, what am I risking here? Not everybody's in the same place as I am at. So eventually, I think that kind of like this toggle between the communitarian and the individual cannot be reduced to, we can't substitute the over attentiveness to the intrapsychic with just the communitarian. So my emphasis on the intrapsychic is because I want to offer theory that actually makes it possible to think in communitarian ways that actually involves people risking something rather than participating because it's going to make them feel better about themselves, or it's going to make them feel like they're doing the right thing. There's nothing wrong with feeling that you're doing the right thing, but if that's what's guiding you, that's going to be very short-lived, and that's not kind of like a good strategy for action. It's not, conceptually, it's not a good metric for action. Now, two things about what you said about Herman. First of all, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Nadia Bouel-Haj's critique of kind of like how the move from Herman's notion of kind of like Vietnam kind of like trauma, which includes at the time a social critique of like people go there and fight an imperial war. And of course they're going to come back damaged, not only because of what they saw, but also because of what they've done, what they've perpetrated, begins to disappear with September 11th, where the damage done to the veterans is by how they are received when they come back, where people don't respect that, you know, the classic example is you're at the mall shopping, why people are keeping you safe, and then they come back and you spit at them, right? So the trauma is caused by how, not by it doesn't have a political analysis. It has actually an analysis that urges Americans to be better Americans, right? So that kind of trauma discourse, which is becoming kind of like quite, which is very much about restoring, kind of like depoliticizing and restoring those subjects to kind of like their American belonging, kind of like is a very different way of thinking about trauma. But, so there's the political and the apolitical, right? Okay, so that's one thing. And the notion of moral injury, right? But this idea of kind of like you process your trauma and you also understand the political circumstances actually stands to really derail you, because understanding the political circumstances to which you have been conscripted, especially kind of like if you're a racialized subject who has, I mean, kind of like think about kind of like the idea of kind of like how many people of color join the army in order to be able to have access to education or other kinds of resources, right? And then discover in the course of their participation that they're actually participating in projects that are very racist, colonialist, imperialist. For you to understand that and be shocked by it, you have to come undone. This is not just it's like the image that you were describing. It's not like looking at the lectern and looking at the atlas and having some cerebral connection with, oh, that's wrong, like I need to think about it differently. It's a real shock to your system. Everything has to come undone. So your entire understanding of how the world works, how you have been used, kind of like how disposable you are. I mean, these are all words that we use, but to kind of like see them as applying to your life, to see how insignificant your body is, to how willing the state is to throw it out, is kind of like a huge shock. It doesn't matter how much you know it, and know it intellectually. And I say this because kind of like sometimes I sit in the clinic with kind of like individuals who are very smart and know all the theory, but to realize how racism has affected them or what they have participated in really causes a crisis. And it's a confusing crisis because they don't not know how this works, but to see it inscribed in you or to see yourself participating on it, it's a shock of an entirely different level. That is not in the direction of synthesis, kind of like in the direction of like higher levels of integration. It's in the direction of more overwhelm and more levels of breakdown. No. Mm-hmm.
It actually confirms the sense that what was pathologized is actually, you know, a kind of ideology of normalization that needs to be resisted. I think we probably, you know, I mean, I think it's really important to honor certain levels of reflective critique in individuals
Mm-hmm.
who've been harmed, and that I don't think that that is something that that happens or sort of mutes or buffers what you're calling becoming
Yeah.
So I see it as, I think that I fully agree with you with the unendingness of it. It's just a matter of, what I was trying to raise is just a matter of where and when and how kind of structurally the political accounts take place.
Yeah.
That's all.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. Is this on?
Oh,
Can you hear me?
Can you hear at the back? No, maybe it's not on. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I want to come back to what you just said about soldiers in a minute, but just to piggyback onto the first question, I have a similar question. Do you think it's a luxury to risk self-preservation?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I think there are communities that are beyond communities where that kind of risk is not possible. And I'm thinking, in fact, of soldiers. I'm thinking of people who are incarcerated. I'm thinking of people who exist beyond the margins of what I think you demarcate as a community. So I'd like to know about that. My sense is that the risk that's at stake that you discuss is really an aesthetic one. To risk going beyond, as you said, encountering things at the borders of what we can bear, which of course implies an intactness, even if it's strategic. So that's my first question. Whether do you
Can I respond to your first question before we go to the next
Sure.
one? Yeah. I actually think exactly the opposite. I think that it is like it can look from a certain angle like who has the luxury to do that? But I think that actually subjects for whom the world does not make a home do not have the luxury to not do that. They may still not do that. Like obviously, like every kind of like these things kind of like vary by time, by individual, by circumstance. But this is not kind of like a theory of intactness. This is really about kind of like what it means to have. At times, even if you have very little, kind of like it's precisely because you have little, if you're not working towards conservation, that you're willing to risk so much. And if you think for a moment about the student protests and who's on the front lines, of like who are the people who are the first to march? They're minorities. There's a reason for that.
Okay, and I would just by way of response, I'd say, often in my experience and understanding, subjects who must make a home for others can't always, or the engagement in riskiness is more fraught. And in terms of, in my experience, and I have worked with thousands of soldiers, it is not the sort of going from naivete to awakening into the political reality of war that is traumatic. Soldiers are very aware when they sign on often that they are signing on even for, for war, what that means, and in terms of sovereignty and nationhood. But my experience is that the trauma associated with war is in coming home to a community, to a country that does not own the trauma with them, which isn't to deny the trauma, it's to readjust or ask for a readjustment in the responsibility of that traumatization.
This is actually so good. It goes back to your question. And this is what I mean by moral injury. Because when we speak about kind of like the community that does not kind of like help the traumatized soldier adjust, what we're really talking about is about repairing the aggressor. We're talking about how to repair the person who, on a subjective level, may have been vulnerable, but has also been dispatched somewhere to go do violence and comes back traumatized because of the violence that they may have themselves been hurt, right? They may have kind of like not even, I'm going to really exaggerate this to make a point. Maybe they didn't kill anybody, but they lost their leg and they didn't do any violence, but they were there on a violent mission. The idea that kind of like soldiers come back, this is the move that happens around September 11th that Nadia Abul Al-Hajj talks about, that kind of like the idea is that the community then does not welcome the aggressor, kind dispatched kind of like by the community, by the state, not the community, by the state, to execute, to be part of its machinery to execute this violence abroad. The imperial wars, the kind of like annexing of kind of like resources and land wars. The idea that it's a community not accepting them back is precisely what I mean about how the reparative expects us. It doesn't happen in this case, but the therapeutic regard that they are harmed because when they come back they're not accepted is precisely a depoliticizing of trauma. That's kind of like goes back to what I was trying to say about the distinction between what Herman says about the Vietnam War, where it is politicized, versus kind of like more recent. And my experience in working, like I have, like I'm thinking of somebody I'm seeing right now, and I'm speaking with their permission about this, who kind of like a woman of color, a black lesbian, who kind of like served in Guantanamo, and who has been kind of like, who had, you can individualize this and say what was wrong with her, that she didn't realize it, but who had not quite felt that she was doing anything because she was not actually doing the torture, and she was just doing paperwork. And it has been hugely dysregulating to her in a million ways to come to realize that she has actually been part of the machine that also does not want her, and has been willing to throw her body like that to kind of like this kind of labor. This shock has not led her to integrate things better. And I don't say this as a bad thing. It has actually made her feel more undone. And that undoing has actually been very generative.
Other questions? Stephen.
Thanks for that conversation. I've been sort of thinking about the last several days of the conference, and the conversations we've been having about the university, and indirectly about the classroom. And I don't know quite how to formulate this, because what I want is for both of you to kind of approach the question of our classrooms, our students, sort of what's happened to our classrooms in terms of our classrooms becoming spaces of safety where certain things and conversations can't be risked. And I'm just mindful of that, like listening to you and thinking about what the passageways are between the session and the classroom. I don't really, I'm not asking a question. I'm like just trying to set up a conversation between the two of you as an analyst and a professor to sort of talk about that, because it's been on my mind. It was on my mind yesterday, and listening to Judith Butler talk about academic freedom of the scholar and how that does not extend to students. It's on my mind when I listened to Pratima sort of talk about the way in which the university has been completely opened up to the public sphere and needs to sort of retreat to make dangerous conversations possible again. Like, it's just been on my mind. And it's kind of a live exigent in sort of listening to the two of you talk, and I just want you to talk about that. I don't know if that makes sense.
You want me to go?
Sure.
Okay, I'll have a go here. And I also think that yesterday we also had a conversation about hospitality, talk about hospitality, and I do think that this question of risking everything that when Derrida writes about hospitality, he talks about the gendered nature of hospitality as well, Lot might be very hospitable, but then what happens to his daughters, etc. Where are the laws of hospitality ones that open some to violation and some to being the perfect host, as it were. And so, I mean, I do think that there's also a moment when Judith Butler yesterday was talking about listening to Max, I think he was called, and learning from him and not wanting to. Opening oneself to a certain risk by learning things, by opening oneself to being exposed to something in the classroom. I mean, I think that this is one of the things that's very interesting to me, Avgi, in the question of the aesthetic that comes up. I have 2 PhD students of my own who have become psychoanalysts, and a couple of others in my department, and I do think that there's, I keep thinking, my goodness, of course they're the ideal psychoanalysts because they're readers of the literature and the aesthetic, there's a way in which. And I'm also sort of thinking about this and what I think of as the clinical turn in a certain kind of psychoanalytic register in the academy at the moment, partly, I mean, to bring up a soldier who understood something about his own raciality and then went into a very particular political manifesto, of course, Fanon. With the publication of Fanon's clinical writings, there's been a great interest in the clinic, so one way in which I think about this point that you're bringing up, Stephen, is that there's a way in which a training in the aesthetic opens one to the possibility of a training of a certain kind of risk of experience, but also a giving up to an understanding that the hermeneutic that one has isn't necessarily the adequate one, which is something that you bring up in the book in relation to La Planche. But I also think that in terms of the classroom, what does it mean to say that the classroom cannot simply be a safe space? When with questions of trigger warnings, etc. Is there a way in which a trigger warning is a bit like a safe word? I don't know. What kind of contract do you build in the classroom such that you organize consent? I remember I was once teaching a course on melancholia, and a student complained to me that it was all rather miserable. And I thought, hello, why did you take a course on melancholia? But anyway, even though we'd actually talked quite a lot about how, the first utopia written in the English language is in a book on melancholy. But anyway, but I think that there is a way in which this question of risking exposing oneself to what one doesn't know and can't make sense of is the beginning of teaching, isn't it? I mean, isn't that what we do as teachers as well? That we know as scholars, right, that we risk going into areas that we can't make sense of. Immediately, we have a sense of the aesthetic as with all sorts of problems maybe associated with it in terms of the sublime, etc. Okay, but the thing that we can't actually completely grasp, and I think that for our students, I mean, something that I encourage anyway with my students, seeing as you're asking me that to speak as a teacher, as a professor, certainly that to be prepared to be shaken up by what you learn in the classroom, to understand that you might not make sense of it, and that you might make sense of it 30 years later, or maybe you won't at all, even though you might keep coming back to it. So to me, the classroom can't be a place of safety. I mean, you have to risk unlearning everything, and to my mind also, given that I suppose melancholia is my term, traumatophilia is your term, that the impoverishment of ego that comes with melancholia is something that stays with me, and that there is that loss of understanding, that loss of ego that might come with it, is very important in the classroom setting. I also think that you know, when I honestly, I had to laugh a little bit when you were talking about the Mia. I was having a thought about one of my own graduate students, and I was thinking, what did you sign up for, and how have I cheated you? So the transferential relation, of course, in the classroom is very vividly explored here as well.
I think kind of like some of the things that you're saying are kind of like very, they make a lot of sense to me in terms of like both that what happens in the classroom put things in motion that may not manifest for a while. So you actually don't quite know at the end of a semester perhaps what has actually happened, because it will continue to evolve. Like I see from when I work with college students or graduate students, like something happens in the classroom, or they remember something from a classroom a while back, and all of a sudden it shifts something. So there's a strange temporality, I think. And there's also the question of like, what do we mean by risk? Is it the risk of upsetting somebody? Is it the risk of somebody taking a class and nothing changing through that class? I think that's a risk to take seriously as well. What does it mean to take a class and to be completely, to just have accumulated knowledge, but to not have been startled into something or out of something? And risk here, I want to say, I understand it very seriously, like not as some kind of like idealized, like you take the risk and it goes well, and like you should take the risk because it's going to work out, and just be bold. It actually could go very wrong. And that's where one tool that we have that you don't have as academics, and I really don't know how you do it, is that we talk about transference all the time, and we work with transference with our patients. And obviously there's so much transference that comes your way. Idealizations, like the kind of like the disappointment of like, I took a class on melancholia and I didn't feel happy, you know, like kind of like these kinds of like illogical and yet meaningfully contradictorious moments which cannot be explored relationally, because of course, you know, talking about the transference deepens the transference, and then now what? Now you've perhaps made yourself more liable to being kind of like brought up on kind of like a complaint. I mean, that's always the fear, and that's one of the reasons why I so admire academics for kind of like getting into the fray this way without kind of like without being able to talk about transference. Okay, I think we're being told.
We are at time, and it's now lunch, so we really will stop. I know it's been a long morning. Avgi, I want to thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Really wonderful conversation.